The Libyan city of Derna was hit by floods in September of 2023, something you may remember making the rounds on the news cycle. Isolated as a single event, it was sad, but with the appropriate backstory, it could be seen as the loss of a culture that had been evolving for almost 1,500 years, and thus a tragedy of epic proportions. Derna's story starts with Al-Andalus, or Muslim Spain, the kingdom that lived from the year 711 to 1492, which was an epicenter of learning during the centuries that the world was run by Islamic trading empires. Eventually, after Spain was retaken by Europeans, the kingdoms of Granada and Valencia still held a large population of former Andalusians, and they were cast out in the 1600s. Now, it may be tempting to think of a country that no longer exists as just gone, but the intellectual and artistic world of Al-Andalus is actually still around, as the Andalusian diasporic influence lives on in Libya. Even after Derna's floods, the city is heir to that culture. It's a place I'd really like to visit one day, honestly, because Al-Andalus is just badass. But the expelling of the Andalusians was also a major moment in world history, as the Islamic trading empires would pass the baton of history to European colonialism in that same era. And we are all still living in the world of European colonialism as of late 2023. That's not to say that the following events are as important as those of Al-Andalus and Derna, but the way history goes, you never really know. Either way, I bring all that up because there are similarities to the story of old Shanghai, which was a capitalist dream in urban form for around 100 years, from the 1840s to its decisive end in the 1930s. However, like Al-Andalus, old Shanghai still lives, it just moved. The story begins during the reign of China's backwards Qing dynasty, which famously decapitated people if they didn't wear a certain haircut. The history of the Opium Wars is basically one of despicable behavior by Europeans and miscalculation by the Qing. The dynasty ignored the threats European traders posed to its sovereignty until it was too late and England had already gone to war with China for the right to sell them opiates. There were several of these wars, and they all ended the same way. Due to the Qing's long-time neglect of its maritime military, the dynasty was helpless in the face of European ships, and its troops were busy fighting elsewhere. The First Opium War ended in 1841 with China surrendering, and the Qing were forced to sign the treaty that marked the birth of European treaty ports along the Chinese coast. Although there was already a Chinese port in the region when Europeans arrived, the establishment of a treaty port in the nearby mudflats marks the beginning of the story of old Shanghai. In the early years of the city, it was made up of 3 Opium War concessions, technically land that was more or less leased at gunpoint from Imperial China by England, the United States, and France. These 3 territories were surrounded by China, but were essentially their own countries, with their own governments and police forces. Shanghai's layout was finalized in 1863 by the formation of the International Settlement, which fused the American and British concessions. The French had originally intended to join, but decided to keep their own territory in the end, a decision that would have major repercussions later on. Something worth noting here is that the European settlements were barely European. Far from being made up solely of Frenchmen, from the start around 12 French nationals lived in the French concession, and it would remain pretty much European-free until the end of old Shanghai. Chinese citizens were the vast majority of residents in all parts of Shanghai from very early on. However, this trend was really solidified by the effects of the Taiping Rebellion, the China-wide revolution attempt in the 1850s and 60s. This massive conflict brought refugees from the interior of China to all of the European concessions on the country's coast, who were hoping European powers would protect them. In Shanghai, this tactic worked, and the European powers didn't kick them out, which encouraged more migration. This influx of refugees helped turn Shanghai into the important city it would become in the interwar era, and would eventually swell its population to roughly 3 million. The Qing dynasty fell to revolution and political backstabbing in 1912, after which the Republic of China was founded in Nanjing. Much of the country fractured into regional rebel states, and these states began fighting the Republic of China and each other in what is known as the Warlord era. But Shanghai was on the coast, far from the largely inland regional wars, and was protected by European powers, and it became its own world. If the culture of old Shanghai could be distilled into one object, it would be the Cheongsam. which is more or less a traditional Chinese garment updated to fit in with Western fashion trends. Pioneered by the well-known socialite and one-time First Lady of China, Madame Wellington Koo, the cheongsam was a version of the traditional Manchurian qizhuang and was altered to be more form-fitting and expose more skin. It not only epitomized the style of old Shanghai, but was also emblematic of one of the city's biggest industries, textiles, or fabric and clothing. Shanghai was littered with textile factories, which utilized the labor of refugees from the Taiping Rebellion. You could see the cheongsam on actresses in the immense output of the Shanghai movie industry, which churned out both dramas and kung fu flicks. Film was introduced to Shanghai in 1896, very early on in movie history, although the local industry was very European-dominated at first. It would take another 17 years for a movie to be made by ethnic Chinese filmmakers, and movies were heavily influenced by U.S. film techniques for decades. But 1928's Burning of Red Lotus Temple, the first kung fu movie, set the tone for an industry unlike any other. It's worth noting that Burning of Red Lotus Temple is a silent film, too. Shanghai's movie industry was one of the oldest in the world. There's a lot of information floating around about the glory days of old Shanghai, on and off YouTube, so I'll take an alternate angle and talk about why old Shanghai was a heaven for criminals. I mentioned that the French choosing to retain their own territory instead of merging with the international settlement was important, and this was because the French authorities in the territory were easily corrupted. We can look at the three territories of the city like this. The international settlement had an actual European population, a competent police force, and very real consequences for criminal behavior, at least if you mess with Europeans. The Chinese areas were, from what I've read, so poor and crowded that they would have been hard to govern at all. However, the French concession was sort of a mixture of those. It was protected by a European power, but in reality lacked a coherent government. That is, unless you counted the Green Gang, an organized crime group that paid around $20 million a year in bribes to French concession officials. All this variety in territorial law was easy to take advantage of. Really easy. It was possible to move from the international settlement and its police, to the French concession and its government, to the old Chinese city and its more or less lack of law, merely by walking, or sprinting even, a few blocks. The borders weren't policed, and cops in the three territories weren't given to sharing information. Basically, as far as being a thicket of borders, Shanghai was a criminal's dream. This is probably why both the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Nationalists, the two organizations that ended up toppling the Qing dynasty and ending China's imperial era, held their revolutionary meetings in the French concession. If someone raided their meeting place, they could take a brisk walk to another country, and the raiders couldn't legally follow. However, the nationalists had another reason to meet in the French concession. The territory was, more or less, run by the Green Gang, and it's a little talked about fact that the nationalists were themselves heavily connected to Chinese organized crime. So there you go. If old Shanghai sounds cool here, well, if it was also extremely sketchy. As I said, there were never many Europeans in Shanghai, who were known as Shanghailanders, and they lived in extreme opulence, basically untouchable due to their protected status in the concessions. Among Chinese residents of Shanghai, or Shanghainese people, there was a wealthy upper class, but it too was far removed from the reality of street-level old Shanghai. In any case, this group was so often kidnapped by gangsters in the 1930s that they were rarely without security guards and rode around in bulletproof private cars. Bottom line, Europeans and wealthy Chinese were the extreme minority. Rich people, revolutionaries, and criminals are interesting, but most Shanghainese were none of those, and life really sucked for most people in the city. For one thing, Shanghai's European settlements were notorious for having way more men than women. So guess what was a big illicit industry in the city? According to my sources, and I'm not making this up, at one point, 1 in 30 Shanghai residents was a prostitute. In addition, the Green Gang had its tentacles everywhere. Opium addiction was an epidemic among the Shanghainese, and the massive amount of street sleepers and beggars is usually noted in accounts of visiting foreigners in the time. Then there's the following statistic, which is just spooky. In the year of 1937, around 22,000 corpses were recorded as being found in the streets of the international settlement, some of them already in coffins. Considering that statistic came from old Shanghai's notoriously corrupt official sources, it's hard to know what the real story is there, but it can't be good. Old Shanghai was known by the not very kind nickname of the Whore of the Orient, and it was generally regarded as a cesspool of sin and depravity, but its fate was still cruel. The city's destruction by the Japanese before and during World War II killed many Shanghainese and put a stop to the party, and while there was a brief return to the good times between World War II and 1949, in that year the Chinese Communist Party would take over China, waking old Shanghai from its capitalist dream/nightmare forever. But this was definitely not the end of the story of old Shanghai. Yes, Shanghai the city was irreparably changed by the communist takeover of the mainland. However, old Shanghai's business and culture managed to avoid being shut down by the communists. Instead, much of old Shanghai uprooted itself and found a new place to call home. Before the communist takeover, Hong Kong wasn't a very happening city. It was a British colony and an international port, sure, but it was a backwater. A large amount of refugees fleeing from the violence of the Taiping Rebellion, then the Boxer Rebellion, then the Sino-Japanese Wars, had previously flowed into the city. But Hong Kong lacked the economy and culture that it would become known for in its later years. And how did it suddenly become one of the world's great cities, you ask? When old Shanghai fell, businessmen, both foreign and Chinese, especially those in the textile industry, fled to Hong Kong, taking their money and know-how with them. Some of them had even ordered industrial equipment that had been headed to Shanghai. This equipment ended up being rerouted and installed in factories in Hong Kong. And because of all the refugees fleeing the communist regime in neighboring Guangdong province, the Shanghai businessmen found another bottomless pool of potential factory labor. Overall, an estimated 1.4 million Shanghai residents would move to Hong Kong. The Shanghainese and Shanghailanders that moved to Hong Kong kept the momentum they had built up back in old Shanghai, to the point that, from the 1970s onward, Hong Kong had a standard of living near that to the west. This is while, just across the border, China remained horribly poor. In the late 1980s, Hong Kong had more foreign trade than the entire mainland, with around a 200th of its population. During its most prosperous years, Hong Kong's textile industry became the workshop for Japanese brands, which were booming, and in this way Hong Kong was, in many ways, the forerunner of the made-in-China industries of the 2000s and 2010s. Old Shanghai's film industry morphed into the powerhouse Hong Kong industry, which churned out a deluge of martial arts films over the years and kickstarted the careers of artists like Wong Kar-wai, Jackie Chan, and Michelle Yeoh. And Hong Kong was essentially China's gate to the world for most of its existence. Goods made on the mainland would be exported to Hong Kong, who would re-export them to the world. As a result, Hong Kong was how China got its hands on foreign currency. Partially because of this, Hong Kong also became a banking capital and long had one of the largest stock markets in the world. In addition, although the Green Gang seems to have died with old Shanghai, organized crime boomed in Hong Kong in the form of the triads. In most ways, the culture that had thrived in old Shanghai adapted very well to its new environment, and trends that began in the treaty port continued in Hong Kong. However, this wasn't meant to last. Certainly the British knew that, as they had never really had an armed presence in Hong Kong. The truth was that China could always have taken Hong Kong back if it wanted, and in 1984 an agreement was reached that set the year of transfer at 1997. But a communist takeover couldn't kill old Shanghai, and to a degree it hasn't killed Hong Kong as a culture either. This is mostly because Hong Kong's elite were given a 13-year head start to emigrate. By 1990, hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers had left the city, and the flood has never stopped. And, unlike the business community's exit from old Shanghai, the elites leaving had ample time to move money and businesses out of Hong Kong. In 1990, polls showed that half of Hong Kong's remaining doctors were planning on leaving, as were 80% of its accountants, 85% of its construction surveyors, and over 2/3 of its professional service staff. Before they could leave, these workers had to raise their prices to save money for the move, so goods of all kinds became more expensive as the handover got closer. And the business climate was quickly drying out. In 1889 alone, 50 companies shifted their place of operation from Hong Kong to elsewhere. So if old Shanghai escaped to Hong Kong, where has Hong Kong escaped to? Well, large numbers of the city's expats now live in Taipei, London, Singapore, Australia, and the United States. But overall, the exodus had a clear focal point, the Canadian city of Vancouver, on the west coast of North America. The massive presence of Hong Kongers there has earned the metropolitan area the nickname Hongcouver. If you want to find some authentic Hong Kong cuisine outside of Asia, that's the spot. Of course, this hasn't entirely had a positive effect on Vancouver, as Hong Kong immigration is part of why property values in the city are ridiculously high, and that has pushed a large amount of the city's population onto the street. As far as the physical city of Shanghai today, well, it might as well be a completely different city. Sure, the old European buildings of the Bund, a neighborhood left over from old Shanghai, are still there, but they're completely dwarfed by a forest of skyscrapers. When I was in Shanghai in 2007, the Bund was most notable to me as a neighborhood good for clubbing. And like much of Europe, it seemed more like a modern city stuffed into old buildings than an area being preserved in any way. These days, remnants of old Shanghai that are not as postcard worthy as the Bund are swiftly being demolished if they already haven't been. And to be fair, this makes sense. Why would a sovereign country want to remember an era that saw itself ruled by outside forces? Not only that, but old Shanghai as a whole was a hugely successful capitalist dreamscape, full of enterprise and glitz, with the suffering that always comes with the income inequality that is capitalism's endgame. Because of this, if capitalism is considered the philosophical enemy, putting old Shanghai on a pedestal would be stupid. And as of early 2023, China is still ruled by the Chinese Communist Party that shut the city down in the first place. However, old Shanghai survives in numerous ways. The exploitative factories of that era now exist throughout Asia. Its film industry remains, to a degree, in Hong Kong, and those who were able to leave Hong Kong have taken wealth derived from old Shanghai with them to various cities in Asia and the West. In short, the saga that began in old Shanghai hasn't seen its end, and it's unclear if it ever will. For a city that hasn't existed for the better part of a century, old Shanghai still refuses to die. This has been another map video. Like it if you learned something, subscribe if you want to see more, and check the comments for corrections. Please chime in if we got something wrong, too. Peace out.